Hi, my name is Bradley Jones, and I'm going to be presenting the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, for our EHS 753 presentation. Um, First portion of the act, why was the act created? And the main portion of the act, when you actually pull it up, is to regulate commerce and protect human health and the environment by requiring testing and necessary use restrictions on certain chemical substances and for other purposes. The law was created because during the time of 1968 to 1969, there was a three-time increase in production of synthetic organic compounds for use in different manufacturing and things like that. As I'll go over later in the presentation, this doesn't cover all toxic substances. There are some exceptions that are covered under different laws. This really got started under John R. Quarles, who is the acting deputy administrator for the EPA. In a testimony to the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Finance, he presented why they needed to have a act like this. And the committee had been thinking for a period of time, since about that 1969 and 1968, about enacting laws. It just had never really taken off until after this testimony and some other documents that were submitted to Congress as well. The big quote from that testimony is that existing federal laws fail to deal evenly and comprehensively with toxic substance problems. While the authority exists to control the production of certain categories of toxic substances, such as pesticides, drugs, and food additives, most existing federal authorities are designed to prevent harmful exposure only after the substances have been introduced into production. The Clean Air Act and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act deal with toxic substances at the point at which they become emissions or effluents. Even the recent Safe Drinking Water Act, while providing long-needed protection against contaminants in drinking water, deals with the problem at a point where the contaminants are difficult to control. So kind of where he was going with this was that the laws that were on the books at the time were reactive and not proactive. Before a new chemical hit the market, there was no laws in place to regulate what was coming onto the market and whether that was safe and how to make it safe for those producing it as well as the consumer. So all the laws in the book, like the Clean Air and all that, dealt with pollutants after the problem had already been out. And like I had said before, along with this, there was other reports and testimony that went into developing the law. Research at the time found upticks in cancer, very rare cancer that hadn't been seen before, that could most likely be linked back to different chemicals. And at this time, there was also a growing concern over PCBs, CFCs, and PBBs. Just on the right there is an example of a PCB. It's something that is, for those of us who are from Wisconsin, specifically the Fox Valley, was something that was big for us, as the paper manufacturers had ended up putting a lot of PCBs in the Fox River, and it's still an ongoing cleanup project. But that was kind of one of the things that started to push towards the legislation. The act itself, the legislation, was passed because of that growing pressure on Congress. It passed with bipartisan support, which definitely shows that it was something that both sides of the aisle wanted, and it's something that was important to everyone. And it eventually became signed into law by Gerald Ford on October 11th of 1976. On to what was included in the act. The specific things was that it gave the EPA the authority to require reporting, require record keeping, require testing requirements as something were to hit the market. There's different testing that needed to be completed, and restrictions relating to chemical substances and mixtures. So it got into different requirements within the acts, which was kind of what I'm going to go over next here. The first of these was requirement of a pre-manufacturer notification. In the TSCA, Section 5A 3C, the main kind of quote was, is something not likely to present a unreasonable risk, and that would keep it out of the TSCA authority. If it was something that was likely to present risk or something else like that, it would go on to the Tsca inventory. And that gets published in the National Registrar, which I'll go over later in this section. It also requires industry testing. So the EPA isn't the organization testing these. It's actually the companies that are coming up with the new chemical mixtures. So if you're coming up with a new chemical, you're required to test for it and prove what's needed as far as anything from PPE to what the public needs to know about those chemicals. So that's general lab practices. They set the standard for what was required for labs to be able to do. Chemical fate testing, which is what happens to the chemical, whether it's in the environment, how does it break down, what does it break down into, and different things like that. Environmental effects testing, how does it affect things in the environment, from our waterways to the air and different things like that. How it affects humans, what PPE is required to get us by with that, and different things like that. And then the identification of specific chemical substance and mixture testing. So it was identifying exactly what's in the mixture and what do those molecules look like. It's very important to industrial hygiene and how those things can interact both with the environment and humans. Continuing on, the Act also required significant new use rules. So if something was already on the registrar, but it was going to be used in a new way, determined by new project volume of manufacture, so that's a significant increase in the volume that the manufacturer is creating. Changes in exposure to humans or the environment in type or form, if there's something, a new processing or something like that that's going to change the way that it could come in contact with the environment or humans, that needed to be notified to the EPA. Changes in magnitude or duration of exposures. So in a new process, is there more time that it's spending contacting humans or the environment? Changes in manufacturing, processing, distribution, commerce, or disposal. Any of those requires a notification to the EPA. And with that, there was a 90-day review process by the EPA prior to the new process being able to be started. So the EPA has to approve it before you can move on with manufacturing. Additional requirements was requirements for importers and exporters, notification of of what's coming in and going out of the country. I included on the right here an actual form that came from FedEx, has it on their website, of the form that just needs to be completed that goes through customs and things like that, either going out of the country or coming back in. And then the manufacturers of the chemicals, mixtures, and distributors of chemicals are required to keep reporting and record keeping on site and keep up to date with everything that they're doing, so that way they can be audited or anything else like that by the EPA. And then it also requires that manufacturers notify the EPA of any new chemicals, any new mixtures, any new substances that could pose a risk, should inform the EPA. If you find something new, study-wise or anything like that, and a chemical that previously thought wasn't to pose a risk, and now you think it will, you need to notify the EPA of that immediately. Currently, so all those chemicals go onto an inventory, and the EPA maintains a Tsca inventory of 85,000 chemicals. I'll get into this a little bit later in the slides here, but a large majority of those chemicals that are on the list are actually grandfathered in chemicals that came in before the Act was enacted. And all these fall under the categories of organics, inorganics, polymers, chemical substances of unknown or variable composition, complex reaction products, and biological material. Where they do not fall under, and these are regulated by different agencies, including pesticides, foods and food additives, drugs, cosmetics, tobacco-related products, nuclear materials, and munitions, don't fall under this under the Toxic Substance Control Act, and are regulated by different agencies. Recently, there was some criticism to the law and moved into updates to the law. And in 2013, mandating and updating the additional safety evaluations and required reports on whether something was likely safe. So that was just updating the lab procedures. Nothing had really been updated since the law kind of came into existence in 1976. So that was updating that. And then in 2016, President Obama also signed into regulating, giving more regulating power to the EPA and the federal government over the states. And that was just kind of to allow the federal government to have more power over the law itself instead of the states. And required permits, there were no direct required permits for manufacturers. Many manufacturers are going to have permits fall under different acts that are out there. But there are different forms that are required, including a remanufacture notice, notice of commencement, which would be, anytime that you're going to start producing a new chemical, and that would include the testing and different things that need to be done under the requirements for the Act. You have export certificates, import certificates, and then the significant new use notification as well that goes into the notifying the EPA of a new manufacture of a new chemical. And then additional information just subject to a fine of $32,500 per day for failing to meet any of the requirements of the Act. That's up to $32,500. I just want to kind of include this last part in here. One of the biggest criticisms of the Act was that when it was enacted, not every chemical needed to be retested and reapproved or approved under the Act. They were grandfathered in when it was first passed. So they went directly into the Tsca inventory. And so with 85,000 chemicals now on the list, that means that prior to the start of it, about 75% of the chemicals on the books are not tested for compliance with the Tsca because of the grandfathering rule. So it was definitely a piece of criticism after the law was enacted, and it was definitely something people didn't fully agree with, and I could see the difficulties between trying to test this many chemicals at once, as well as making sure that everyone's safe. So it's definitely a difficult thing when they enacted the law. And then my last slide here is just my references. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it.